The arrival of the $2,200 Panasonic GH6 is exciting news for vloggers and video shooters. With an all-new sensor and features like ProRes and 5.7K 60p video, it looks like a worthy update to the popular GH5. Panasonic pioneered high-quality mirrorless video and had the market to itself for a while. But it's now crowded with models from Canon, Sony, and Nikon offering similar features for similar prices. Some, like Sony's a7 IV and Canon's EOS R6, offer bigger sensors and better autofocus systems. Panasonic has its own full-frame lineup too, including the similarly priced Lumix S5. So is there still a place in the world for a video-centric Micro Four Thirds camera with contrast detect autofocus? I took a final production model out in the French countryside to find out. At first glance, the GH6 looks similar to the GH5, but there are some big differences on closer inspection. The first thing that jumps out is the hump on the back. It accommodates both a multi-angle flip-out display and a fan to cool it down for continuous video shooting. The grip has also changed and is now the biggest I've seen on maybe any mirrorless camera. With a new, tackier material and bigger ridge, I felt there was no way I could drop it. The control layout is similar, but has tweaks borrowed from the full-frame S1H. The most noticeable one is the switch on the left side that lets you lock out any controls you want. The other is a dedicated AF button to switch autofocus modes, areas, eye detect, and more. The GH6 has an extra customizable button on the front, plus a second video record button that's ideal for vloggers. There's another record button on top, plus a nice dedicated audio control for setting levels, quality, and more without diving into menus. Those menus are the same as you'll find on the GH5 II or S5. They're among the best on any mirrorless camera, with logical categories and not too much scrolling needed. Plus, they can be operated by touch or buttons. Of course, the 1.84 million dot rear touchscreen fully articulates for vlogging, but it does another new trick by tilting up 30 degrees. Much like the S1H, that lets you keep it clear of the microphone and HDMI ports for vlogging or external capture. The 3.68 million dot OLED electronic viewfinder is sharp, but limited to a 60 Hz refresh rate. That's not too huge a deal, as higher EVF frequencies aren't really useful for video. With more demanding ProRes video, the GH6 requires faster storage speeds than the GH5. For that, it uses a high-speed CF Express slot along with a UHS-2 slot. The drawback is that for ProRes or other high data rate video, you won't be able to back up to an SD card. As for ports, it has a full-sized HDMI and 10 gigabit per second USB-C port, along with headphone and microphone jacks. Overall, the GH6 is one of the best handling cameras I've used, particularly for video. It's easy to change key settings and hard to accidentally activate the wrong setting. At 823 grams, it is heavy for a Micro Four Thirds camera though. What I didn't like as much either was the battery life. The GH6 is rated for just 350 still images on a charge or an hour of continuous 4K recording. On one of our shoots, it didn't manage more than about 45 minutes of stop-start shooting, so you'll want to buy and carry a lot of extra batteries. Now let's get to the most interesting part of this camera, video. For that, the GH6 is better than its predecessor in nearly every way, from resolution to stabilization to dynamic range. The GH6 can shoot 5.7K all the way up to 60 frames per second, DCI 4K at up to 120 frames per second, and 1080p at 240 frames per second. 10-bit video with billions of colors is available for most of these formats, with an I mode for easier editing and L mode to conserve space. It also supports ProRes, a format that gobbles card space but is easier to work with than MP4. It only supports 5.7K 25p video for now, but 4K will be supported with a firmware update. Raw output is also coming later. The 5.7K ProRes footage allows for crisp, downsampled 4K footage or cropping where needed. It'll play in real time with a modest editing computer, but file sizes are massive. 4K at 120 frames per second is a big plus for dramatic slow-mo, and unlike with rivals, there's no drop in sharpness at those higher frame rates. The only downside to 120p is that a feature called Dynamic Range Boost isn't supported. So what is that? Rather than dual native ISO like the GH5, the GH6 has Dynamic Range Boost. It combines high and low gain readouts to deliver extra dynamic range at ISO settings over 800. It's also Panasonic's first non-professional camera with full V-Log and not hobbled V-Log L. With all that, video quality is outstanding, particularly in demanding, contrasty scenes. It's sharp, colors are accurate, and the extra stop of dynamic range over the GH5 gives editors room to push and pull video in post-production. Considering the small sensor, the GH6 is a decent low-light camera too. Noise is well controlled up to ISO 12800, though it's best to stay below that. That's aided by Panasonic's new 3D noise reduction that kicks in at higher ISOs to suppress grain. The downside with the system is that weirdly, there's more noise and shadows at low ISOs. That's because the dynamic range boost can't be engaged below ISO 800. Panasonic has boosted the in-body stabilization to 7.5 stops with supported lenses. That's just below Canon's R6, but numbers only tell part of the story. It's not only great for handheld video, but is the best camera for walk-around shooting I've ever tried. If you do hit the odd jolt or jerk the camera around, you won't see too much wobble or jello either, as rolling shutter is well controlled. That's a big benefit of a smaller sensor. Video shooters have been screaming for a histogram display, and Panasonic has finally added one. The GH6's biggest issue is still the contrast detect autofocus, or what Panasonic calls depth from defocus. It is improved over the GH5 with new AI smarts to boost tracking and subject recognition. However, it still isn't as fast or accurate as the phase detect systems on rival cameras. Because of this, I don't always trust it for interviews, stand-up, or other situations. One thing that helps is to shoot at higher frame rates, as it works better if it has more frames to analyze. Overall, Panasonic has done as much as it can do with contrast detect, but it's just a fundamentally inferior system. Luckily, the company is starting to hint that phase detect might arrive in future models. Now let's talk about photography. With relatively slow 7 frame per second burst speeds with continuous autofocus, the GH6 is not a great choice for action or wildlife shooting. If you're into that and want Micro Four Thirds, get the Olympus OM1 instead. There are improvements that make it good for certain things though, particularly the 25.2 megapixel sensor. That's the highest resolution yet on a Micro Four Thirds camera, so it's more useful than the GH5 for things a hybrid shooter might do, like product photography or portraits. Just like video, photos have improved dynamic range, sharpness, and high ISO capability. The dynamic range boost is particularly useful for raw photos in tricky lighting situations, letting you pull detail out of shadows and highlights. Finally, the contrast detect AF isn't as big a drawback for photos as it is for video. It usually delivered sharp photos for burst shooting with human or animal subjects, though it's still not as reliable as recent competing cameras. Panasonic's GH6 delivers nearly everything that vloggers and creators could want. The stabilization system and handling are first-rate, and video quality is outstanding. It's more affordable than rival full-frame cameras with similar capabilities. As usual, the bugbear with the GH6 is the contrast detect autofocus that's not up to par with Sony and Canon's latest offerings. It's also heavy for a Micro Four Thirds camera, and battery life is subpar. It has some stiff competition like the Sony a7 IV and Canon EOS R6, both priced at $2,500. For a lot less, look at Fujifilm's $1,700 X-T4 or the $960 Nikon ZFC. All that said, the GH6 is a top choice for vlogging and content creation, as long as you're aware of the limitations. Hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and for more on technology, check out Engadget.com.